Ezra Levant from Rebel News. Thank you so much for speaking to us here at the Aussie Wire. One of the things I appreciate about you, I actually met you briefly in Australia many, many years ago. You came to Australia for the Friedman Conference, if I remember rightly. And even right back then, it was very, very clear your passion for the alternative media, but also your desire to work collaboratively and to work to build up the media as an alternative media, as a legitimate alternative to the mainstream. You've had tremendous success since then. That success in part has brought you here to the Aussie Wire, to the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship inaugural event here. Why are you here? What are you hoping to get?
Well, we've gone to the World Economic Forum a few times. In fact, Avi has had great success there. Avi's our Australian bureau chief, as you know.
Yeah.
And Jordan Peterson, who I think is the leading public intellectual on the right, he talked about a counterweight to the World Economic Forum.
Yeah.
And I think this is his, in large part, his creation. Obviously, a lot of people were involved.
Sure.
So I wanted to see it. I also wanted to meet other like-minded people with a freedom orientation. And there's so many, not just the speakers, but other delegates here are very interesting. So I've enjoyed it. And I'm interested in Australia, of course, because Avi has built a real following there.
Yeah.
And I think, like Canada, Australia is in need of alternative independent media.
Yeah.
Our motto is telling the other side of the story.
Yeah.
And that used to be universally believed by most journalists. Everyone used to know, well, what's the other side of the story? When you think about it in medicine, we say, well, I'd like a second opinion. It's not an insult to the first doctor.
Yeah.
You just want to hear another point of view. And these days, you have to remind people it's okay to have another point of view. We should probably hear a few points of view before making a decision. But unfortunately, in the woke era in which we live, it's almost like there's one narrative, and if you deviate from it, not only will you be silenced, they'll claim it's misinformation, it has to be fact-checked and banned and deplatformed. So that's why I'm so excited when I meet other people who want to start alternative media.
Yeah.
To speak truth to power, really.
Yeah. Well, I was going to get to the censorship issue. I'm a big fan of Avi's. I think what he's done is absolutely incredible in Australia, and obviously Rebel News around the world. You've got bureaus in various parts of the world, but there really seems to be a systematic pushback against allowing the other side to be spoken. How is Rebel News surviving in a landscape where one wrong statement in a YouTube video can cost you an entire YouTube channel? And that's true of most social media platforms, not just YouTube. How do you survive in that environment?
Well, it's hard because we have a pretty large YouTube channel, 1.6 million viewers, but one day they cut off our monetization completely.
Yeah.
We were on track to make $1 million a year.
Yeah.
Then there's something on YouTube called Super Chat. It's like a tip. Okay, we were on track to make $400,000 a year. They cut that off. And their excuses, their reasons are laughable.
Yeah.
But that's the thing. So we rely on our viewers. We don't take any government money.
Yep.
And actually, the fact that we were demonetized, in a way, it set us free. Let me give you an example of what I mean by that. Because we lost our monetization in 2017, before the pandemic, we really had almost no advertising money. It was almost all from our viewers.
Yeah.
And so what could they do to us during the pandemic when we said, well, we're skeptics of the lockdown? You know, people can take the vaccine as their own choice, but they shouldn't be forced to. So we weren't as afraid anymore because they had already pulled the trigger on us. I mean, I guess they could have completely banned us, but our answer at Rebel News, and it may be different for other independent media, was to try and cultivate a direct relationship. We rely on crowdfunding.
Yeah.
And the thing about crowdfunding is you get lots of little donations,
Sure.
$10, $20. The average gift to Rebel News is $58.
Yeah, right.
And that's a fair bit of dough when you think about it, but in another way it's not.
Yeah.
So if we crowdfund enough for our staff or a journey, let's say,
Yeah.
it's a lot of little gifts. And here's the thing. Our journalists, they don't know who's chipping in $50 or $100, so they don't know who the donors are.
Yeah.
And even if they did, there's no one donor who's so large that they could pick up the phone and say, hey, that Avi Yamini's getting out of hand, fire him. There's just, when you spread out the crowdfunding amongst thousands of people, not only are you not beholden to any one person other than your own conscience, it makes you really attentive to your viewers. because they say, hey, what about this? Or why aren't you covering that? You've really got to listen to them, because if you don't, you're going to lose their support. Contrast that with, say, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, the ABC.
Yeah.
Really, they just have to please one man.
Yeah.
In a way, the government.
Yeah.
And so they can ignore or even insult or even abuse their viewers and the taxpayers, because they don't have to win the hearts and minds of their viewers. They just got to please one guy to keep that government check coming. So it's an unusual way to do media, crowdfunding, but we love it because that means, if you're going to get your money from the government or from a large corporation, you better be ready to do what those oligarchs say.
Yeah, money carries power. In a way, you've already answered my next question. I'm going to ask it anyway because I want to tease this out a little bit deeper. There is a trajectory that I've noticed, and feel free to disagree with me if you don't agree with this, but I've noticed new startups in the media, and I'm talking about startups from the last 30 years or so, Fox News, Sky News, perhaps some others that I won't mention because they might be in the room with us. They start as an outlier, and their focus is gathering eyeballs and speaking the truth and being the maverick.
Right.
But at some point, there's a change where they go from, we're going to keep putting money in order to grow, they shift their focus to now it's time to get money back out again. The investors want their returns now. We've been running for 5 years, 10 years, whatever it may be. And invariably, and we see this happening, they start firing presenters that have shows that are a bit too edgy. We've seen this with Fox News. They got rid of Tucker Carlson, the most watched news personality on the planet at the time. Like they literally fired their number one dude because someone said so. We see it with Sky News in Australia, the number of people that have been shown the door there because they just wouldn't stop talking about things they were told not to. How are you protecting Rebel News against that same progression, making sure that Rebel News doesn't suffer that same fate?
Well, there's a few answers to that. One is I'm the sole owner of the company. So I don't have a boss who can pick up the phone and say, fire Avi.
Sure.
I like Avi as a friend. I admire him as a journalist. I think he's got a lot of courage. And, he has gotten into trouble. Like, he was arrested many times, and our answer was to double down. So we hired lawyers, and we actually sued the police in Victoria. And we actually...
And won.
And that was not easy. You had to have a good lawyer. You had to have some funds. You had to have some patience. And
some balls.
And then we went after Avi's security. Daniel, who's that gentle giant who would always protect him. He's a great guy. Then the police stopped going after Avi, but then they went after Daniel. So we helped him legally too. So I think part of the answer is in our name, Rebel News. So we're sort of perpetually contrarian, not for its own sake, but going back to our motto, telling the other side of the story. And I think that Avi really lives the rebel lifestyle. My favorite thing about him, I'll tell you this, and I would say this if he was right here. My favorite thing about Avi Yamini is his self-deprecating sense of humor. I guess a close second, and it's related, is it doesn't matter what race you are, what religion you are. Avi's Jewish, and he's racialized, as the kids say. But he's a friend to all. He'll meet you as he finds you, and he's got that banter. He's a bit of a larrikin, if I can use an Australian word, and that wins people over. And I think he's a very special guy, and he's a reason why Rebel News has done well in Australia. But one more thing that's been really useful for me, I'm a Canadian, is that the stories from Australia are stories that Canadians and Brits and Americans care about too. Think about it. Melbourne was one of the most locked down cities in the world. Those stories were, yes, Avi told stories about Australia to Australians, but I can assure you an enormous number of eyeballs were the rest of the world saying, what the heck's going on with the lucky country? What's going on down under? Some of the themes of Antifa, some of the themes of censorship. Avi's fought against censorship down under. These are not just Australia stories. British, American, Canadian, even in other countries. Avi was recently in New Zealand for his book launch. Antifa managed to terrify a church into canceling on him. That's a global story in a way. It's a New Zealand story and it's an Aussie story, but it's a global story. Cancel culture, silencing dissident voices. Avi's friendly manner, he became friends with some of the Maori churches, and they instantly re-platformed him.
Yeah.
And Antifa doesn't have the courage to take on the Mallory. It was a pleasure to travel and to see that, and to see them give him a haka was very stirring, especially for a Canadian who's not used to that dramatic welcome.
Yeah.
So I guess there's always room for citizen journalists who follow the facts, have an interesting, something interesting to say, have a genuine curiosity, love people. Avi's strength in my mind, I know I'm praising him a lot, but I'm trying to think of why is Rebel News successful in Australia. He's also out there in the world. He's not just in his studio. And other people, I mean, Rukshan Fernando became a global figure also, just by going out into the street and turning on his cell phone and just showing people. And in a way that's, I mean, I really like Rukshan too, but it's sort of pitiful that simply turning on the camera is the best journalism in the city. It shows you how low the standards have fallen, that the other guys stayed in their office hours. Let me give you one more quick example. I don't want to monopolize, but in Montreal, Canada, it was really harsh lockdown, comparable in some ways to Melbourne. They had an actual curfew from 10 p.m. to 5 a.m. Whether you were jabbed or not, whether you were sick or you couldn't leave your house. They actually had a rule against walking your dog. It was crazy. So now there was an exemption for journalists. So we went out into the streets. We got ticketed nonetheless. We went out in the streets and did the journalism. The police attacked us, we sued them, they gave us an apology. And one of the things they said is, we just weren't used to this. We weren't, as in, the rest of the media was so compliant and so submissive, they weren't used to journalists out there covering the curfew. They weren't used to journalists pushing back on police. That's pitiful. I mean, I'm an amateur. I didn't go to journalism school. In our whole company, only one guy went to journalism school. Everyone else is just an amateur citizen. And I mean, I love them all, but it's sort of pitiful that a bunch of citizen journalists who I love, I'm not disparaging, if we're doing more journalism than the big boys, who, same with the trucker convoy, they hid in their office towers. Oh, we're afraid of these truckers. What, are you afraid of a horn honk? You know, and so I think journalism is not a profession, it's not a guild, it's an activity. And if you've got a cell phone, you're a journalist.
You can do the activity.
And on any cell phone you buy today, you have enough video power, you got a good camera, you got editing software, you can get a Twitter account, you can be a journalist today. And that's what scares the regime media, the legacy media, the zero barrier to entry. And now we don't just have to submissively accept what the regime journalists tell us, we can push back. And it's a real crisis because that guild of high priests, oh, we know the news, they're trying to get back at the citizen guys by saying, oh, we've got official fact checkers. No, those are just journalists who, instead of running a counterpiece, and what makes them any better than us? So the empire strikes back. They're trying to smash the upstarts. But it's a fun place to be. You know, it's not, you're not going to get rich doing citizen journalism, but you'll feel great about yourself. You'll feel great about speaking truth to power. You'll meet interesting people, and you'll feel like you're part of a revolution.
I want to. There's a few things I want to follow up on, but before I do that, I want to jump on the Avi Yemeni praising bandwagon. Don't tell him I said nice things, please. I believed can you believe? I believed the media and what they said about Avi early on. The stories that were told as they tried to trash his reputation, and I was naive enough to believe that. Now, I've been a citizen journalist since 2009. I began investigative journalism into technical issues, water supply for irrigation and so forth, way back then. Along comes COVID, I began speaking out very early, and then I was like, oh, this Avi guy, well, initially he was actually pro-lockdown, right? When he first started speaking out, he was actually in support of the lockdowns. And then he realized, and to his credit, he flipped, and he acknowledged that he'd flipped. Some people flip and they try and pretend that, no, he's, you know him, he's honest to a fault in some ways. He was completely upfront about it. And I was like, no, not Avi. I don't want him on my side, not that guy. Anyway, of course, he became an incredibly effective voice. He just had the courage to just get in there and report.
Yeah.
So then when I was directing Battleground Melbourne, which was a documentary that documents those 2 years in Melbourne, I was like, I can't tell this story and I can't do this justice without including Avi. Yeah. And I still didn't like the idea. I was still like, all right, fine. So I actually met him properly. We'd passed each other, we'd said hello, but I met him properly for the first time when I interviewed him for that documentary. And what I discovered was one of the most remarkable human beings I've ever met. He was a pleasure to talk to, that self-depreciating humor that you spoke of, that ability to laugh at himself and laugh at everybody else. And actually a really grounded sense of self. That's what surprised me the most. There was no ego there. He's a larrikin, but it's not an ego larrikin. He's just a larrikin.
He's an interesting character who's had an interesting life. I mean, he just came out with his autobiography,
A Rebel
Rebels.
From the Start.
And I mean, just even his family, he grew up the largest family in Australia. I think there was 17.
17, yeah.
So, I mean, he's certainly one in a million. Yeah. And maybe that's a good thing.
I can claim credit for the most thorough review of his book out of everybody. I don't believe that anybody else has tested how well it burns. I mean, I'm sure it's going to end up on a book burning pile at some point in history. So I burned it. It burns very well, I can confirm.
You know, I mean, we both get a kick out of him, and his personality is certainly what drives a lot of his viewership. But I believe that even if someone didn't have his extroverted style and his sense of humor, there is such a huge unmet demand for independent news that even if someone wasn't particularly funny and wasn't particularly extroverted, simply showing up with the camera on location is half the battle sometimes. And you know that in your bones, because I bet half the videos you watch are found footage. Some guy somewhere filmed something on their cell phone and they just uploaded it. I mean, half of a real newscast from the incumbents is just stuff that's on Twitter and the internet. So, I don't know. I think it's a wonderful hobby to be a citizen journalist. It is tough to earn enough to make it a full-time job. But I think it's also a form of political therapy for people who are just, in the past, would shake their fist at the TV. Oh, well, now you can do something about it. And that's a bit of a miracle. Like, go back, what's the age of the iPhone? It's only a dozen years old. iPhone's a dozen years old. Twitter is not even, I don't think.
YouTube 2004, I think it was.
And it wasn't even until more recently that it became, like, think about how lonely or frustrated. I mean, there was some talk radio, but even that, there were gatekeepers. So we are in a new era. It's a little bit scary sometimes, but it's empowering for people who felt shut out.
Last question, I want to bring it back to ARC before we wind up. One of the criticisms that I'm seeing a lot online about the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship is this idea that it's just another elite talk fest. You look at who's up on stage. Most of them have big followings already. They've already got a lot of influence. Many of them are quite wealthy, not all, but many. And many of them have their hands on levers of power in various forms. How can a talk fest actually make any kind of a difference and make the world a better place?
Well, and I think that's what they're going to try and figure out, because there's different expressions of freedom. There's conservatism, there's libertarianism, populism. How do all these things resolve? I think they're figuring that out as they go. You're right, it is. There are many thought leader elites here. Jordan Peterson himself, I think he really is the world's most prominent public intellectual on the right-hand side of things. In a way, this is a counterweight to the other elites at the World Economic Forum and the United Nations. I don't know, and I'm glad I don't have to square that circle. I can attend, and I'm finding it interesting. It's sort of like some of these lectures are like a university course lecture, and it's been a while since I've been in college, so I'm learning a little bit. And I like meeting other people, including other citizen journalists. So I'm not too fussed on that question, because someone else is going to answer it. For me, it was enjoying the speakers, meeting other delegates. I think there's 71 countries represented, if I heard that right. So where it goes, I mean, I'm interested in that question, but it's not for me to answer.
Well, Ezra Levant from Rebel News, thank you so much for Rebel News and all that you've done for journalism.
Thank you.
Thank you for empowering Avi and helping him to become all that he's become. He's awesome, and I love him. He's a friend now, and I'm happy to say that. And thank you for speaking with us here at the Aussie Wire.
My pleasure, and I wish you all success.
Thank you.